One of the most tragic and heartbreaking stories in rock and roll and music history is that of the great Welsh band Badfinger. Originally signed to the Beatles' Apple label, and really a group that personified a sound in the early to mid 70s that really became known as power pop in so many ways. An amazing band that unfortunately their story has sort of been summarized by that of tragedy and bad luck and mismanagement and death. And so it's a interesting band to look at. They are one of my absolute favorites, and their music brings me such joy. But along with that joy comes such a sense of disappointment in the way that they were sort of treated by the system, by management, and sort of the music business, if you will. Of course, I'm talking about Badfinger, and the point of this video is to talk about what I believe is the most important release and reissue of 2024, and that is the 50th anniversary of the album that never really was, Head First. So I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about this album, why it's so important, and why I just love that it was finally released. So a lot of people have heard about Badfinger. A ton of people have heard Badfinger songs, even if you don't know it's Badfinger. They're certainly one of those bands that people say, oh, I don't know if I know Badfinger. And then you play, 3 or 4 songs and people, are, oh yeah, I know that one. I know that one. I know that one. But I want to fast forward to 1974 in their career. They had recently signed, their management had recently signed a recording contract with Warner Brothers that was focused on releasing 6 records in 3 years. A pretty ridiculous ask, but something that Stan Polly and Warner Brothers were in favor of. And so the second of those releases on the Warner Brothers label that came out in November of 1974 was this record, Wish You Were Here, which at the time remained on shelves for 7 weeks before a lawsuit was broken out between Warner Brothers, the Badfinger management, and the band itself. During that time of the lawsuit, this record was pulled from shelves. This has sort of made this one of the more rare Badfinger records. It's not an overly expensive record by any means. It's not the, some kind of wild grail, but this is something that was pulled from the shelves after 7 weeks because of an ongoing legal dispute between Warner Brothers and the management and the band itself. After this was released in November of 1974, because of that recording contract, they were already back in the studio in late November, early December, recording what would be their third album for Warner Brothers, which eventually became known as Head First. Of course, during the recordings of this record was also then when the recordings of this were sort of happening simultaneously of the release of Wish You Were Here. And because of all those disputes, these recordings happened. Master tapes lived somewhere, and then the recordings were eventually shelved and never actually released until many years later because of that dispute. As that ongoing lawsuit was happening, Badfinger, as a band and as artists, were not receiving their paychecks anymore. They went into complete financial turmoil. And just about 4 months later, in April of 1975, one of the leaders and main songwriters, Pete Ham, would take his own life. There were a couple of incarnations a little bit later on of Badfinger, but eventually another main songwriter and singer, Tom Evans, would end up taking his own life in the 80s as well. So the recordings and the tracks of this record had sort of sat on shelves somewhere, owned by no one, sort of Warner, whatever it was. And it's important to note that at this point, this was a one-off lineup of the band. Of course, you had Pete Ham, you had Tom Evans, you had Mike Gibbons, but at this point, Joey Mullen had left the band, and Bob Jackson was in the band. The technicality, Bob Jackson actually came in to replace Pete, who had left, and then Pete had come back, and they were a 5-piece. and then Joey ended up leaving for the recording of this record. So this is a one-off lineup of the four-piece. Bob Jackson's actually the one who was able to put this together over the years. Now, this saw a CD release in 2000, and it was sort of labeled as this was their last or their final, Badfinger's final release. But really, again, it was more in line with being their 8th release, with recordings from 1974 set to be released in 1975. So, as a huge Badfinger fan, and as a person who has said countless times on this platform and others, this is the band that we need like the HBO miniseries on. We need like the Sparks treatment, essentially, of Badfinger. We need people to know the history of this band, and not just the doom and gloom and tragedy, although it is tragic. We need people to understand just how amazing of songwriters and musicians, and just how amazing of a band Badfinger was, and why they were so important to the sound in the early to mid 70s. Especially in the realm of power pop, but then also just general songwriting as well. So this was released on CD in the year 2000, but completely rough mixes. I mean, they were essentially released as a demo CD, and it was up until about 2 weeks ago that this was finally remixed, remastered, whatever you want to call it, pressed to vinyl for the first time by Bob Jackson, the last remaining sole member of this band at the time. They found the master tapes. They were able to get the stuff from Warner, all that kind of legal stuff that I won't go into or I don't fully understand. But this record came out. It was released. The sort of lost record of the tapes, all that good stuff from 1974 that was set to be released in 1975 that was never released, was finally released this year. To me, this is a record that I think pairs extremely well with Wish You Were Here. They went into the studio, were given 2 weeks. They got off a tour, they were tired, they were exhausted, and then management again said, hey, we got a deal. Again, 6 records, 3 years. They go in and say, what did they have? They had Abbey Road Studios for 2 weeks to really write and record this whole record. And to me, they obviously were only able to officially do 2 records of that 6-record deal. This would have been the 3rd. But you got the sense with some of the music that it was just fatigue. I'll be honest, I don't think Badfinger ever wrote a bad song. Never wrote a bad song, especially Pete Ham, Tom Evans, and especially Pete Ham. I think Pete Ham is the most underrated songwriter ever. I would say that 1000%, especially in the history of rock and roll. But you got the sense that there was fatigue, creativity, fatigue, all that different stuff that would go on when you're asked to record 6 records in 3 years while also touring. And so for me, for any fan of Badfinger, for any fan of sort of the relic of the lost recordings, all that different stuff, this to me is the most important release and reissue of this year. 50th anniversary on vinyl for the very, very first time. This whole project was put together by Bob Jackson. Great gatefold here. You can see him right there. Comes with a full booklet. It's got all the lyrics. It's got the great piano that so many classic Badfinger tracks are written on, specifically Without You was written on there. And also sort of a letter of the history written from Bob on behalf of the band. Again, knowing that from this incarnation of the band, he is the only one who is left. So again, for fans of rock and roll, for fans of power pop, for fans obviously of Badfinger, I wanted to make a video about this because, as I said before, so much of when we talk about Badfinger, it is clouded in, it's like the yeah, but. It's like when someone brings a Badfinger, it's like, oh man, what a terrible story, what a sad story. And it is, and sometimes I feel that overshadows the amazing music and art that was created by these musicians. And so I wanted to sort of do this video because I feel like the Badfinger story is still so underrepresented, not only just in society, in music and culture, etc., but especially here on YouTube, especially here in the vinyl community where people show records. And I just think for any fan of power pop, for any fan of Apple records, for fans of the Beatles, for fans of kind of forgotten lost stories of rock and roll, this is a absolute banging release, an amazing record. It feels like it's new, but it feels right on time for 1974, 1975 as well. And truthfully, I just wanted to make a video talking about my love for this release, why I feel it's so important, why I'm so thankful we got it, and why I love Badfinger so much. So there you have it. It's something a little bit different for me. Curious if there's any Badfinger fans out there. Your thoughts on this, all that kind of good stuff, but wanted to make a video kind of talking about it. So thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. And yeah, check out some Badfinger. Go buy Head First on vinyl for the first time ever. And yeah, have a great rest of your day. Take care, y'all. Bye.